There comes a moment in every life when pain no longer whispers, it roars, it shakes the foundations of who we thought we were. In those moments, we're not just hurting, we're questioning everything. Why did this happen? What am I meant to do with this? Is there something deeper behind the suffering? Carl Jung believed that these moments aren't accidents. They are invitations, sacred, mysterious, and often terrifying. They force us to stop living on the surface and begin a descent into the depths of our true self. Not the self we show to the world, not the version we've carefully constructed, but the self that knows, the self that waits in silence, through every loss, every shadow, and every tear. This isn't about avoiding pain. It's about meeting it face to face and listening. Because inside our darkest experiences lies something extraordinary. The blueprint for healing, the seed of transformation, and the beginning of purpose. Jung didn't just study the human soul, he honored it, and he taught that suffering, when understood, becomes the bridge to wholeness, not by erasing the pain, but by revealing its deeper meaning. In this journey, you're not just surviving, you're becoming. Suffering is one of the most universal and intimate aspects of being human. No matter where you live, how old you are, or what kind of life you lead, suffering finds a way into your story. It may come through loss, illness, regret, loneliness, or simply the pain of growing older. And yet, for something so common, suffering often feels like something we don't fully understand. Most of us try to avoid it, numb it, or push it away. But Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, saw suffering differently. He believed that pain was not just something to endure, but something to explore, something that holds the key to a deeper, richer life. Jung recognized that pain wasn't just a physical or emotional burden, it was a message from the soul. When we feel broken, lost, or stuck in grief, it's not just bad luck, it's a sign that something inside us is calling for attention. Jung once said, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." What he meant was that when we try to avoid pain, by pretending it's not there or distracting ourselves, we don't eliminate it. Instead, we create other problems: anxiety, depression, emptiness. In his view, the real path to healing is not in escaping suffering, but in facing it, understanding it, and letting it transform us. Unlike many modern thinkers, Jung believed suffering had meaning, not necessarily a logical reason, like everything happens for a reason, but a psychological and spiritual significance. He saw suffering as part of the journey toward what he called individuation, becoming your true self. Just as a seed must break open to become a tree, Jung believed the soul often has to break in order to grow. In this way, pain is not just an obstacle. It's an invitation to deepen, to evolve, and to discover parts of ourselves we didn't know were there. Think about the moments in your life when you grew the most. Chances are they weren't times of comfort or ease. They were probably times when you were struggling, perhaps feeling lost after a loved one passed away, or reevaluating your identity after retirement, or working through past wounds that never quite healed. Jung believed these moments were sacred. He often compared the soul to a deep well where suffering stirs the waters and brings hidden truths to the surface. As we age, suffering can feel even more intense. The losses can add up, of health, of loved ones, of purpose. But Jung would say that this stage of life is not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of a more inward path. In our later years, we are often invited to turn inward and explore the questions we may have set aside when we were busy building careers or raising families. Suffering in this phase is not punishment. It's an opening. It invites reflection, wisdom, and a deeper connection with the self. One of Jung's most powerful ideas was that we are not just our thoughts or behaviors, we are also our unconscious. Beneath our everyday awareness is a vast realm filled with emotions, memories, and images. And when we suffer, the unconscious often sends up signals through dreams, symptoms, or even unexpected emotions. Jung believed that paying attention to these signs could help us understand the real roots of our pain, not just what happened, but what it means for our growth, healing, and wholeness. It's easy to think of suffering as something that happens to us, but Jung encouraged us to see it as something that happens for us, not because we deserve it or because the universe is testing us, but because the soul uses suffering as a tool for transformation. Of course, this doesn't make the pain go away, but it gives it a shape, a direction, and, ultimately, a purpose. Suffering isolates, but it also connects. When we see our pain as part of the human story, as something Carl Jung explored deeply, we feel less alone. We begin to see that even in our darkest times, we are not lost. We are being called, gently or painfully, into a deeper relationship with who we really are. In the end, suffering remains a mystery, but through Jung's eyes it becomes a sacred mystery, one that, when approached with honesty and openness, can lead us not just through the pain, but beyond it, into meaning, peace, and a truer connection with the soul. Carl Jung didn't believe in avoiding pain. He didn't view suffering as a mistake or a flaw in human experience. Instead, he saw it as a natural, even essential part of psychological development. While much of modern culture is focused on comfort, quick solutions, and positivity, Jung's approach was bold, profound, and at times uncomfortable. He believed that pain has a purpose, not because it feels good, but because it serves as a bridge between who we are now and who we are meant to become. Jung understood that pain often arises when there is a conflict within us, a split between different parts of the self. Maybe we want to appear strong, but inside we feel fragile. Maybe we try to be peaceful, but carry unresolved anger. These inner contradictions create tension, and eventually, that tension becomes emotional or even physical suffering. Jung believed that pain is the psyche's way of saying something important is being ignored. This is why he saw pain not as a punishment, but as a messenger. Suffering is a signal that something inside us wants to be seen, healed, or integrated. He often said that what we resist persists. In other words, the more we try to escape pain, through denial, distraction, or even false positivity, the more it lingers beneath the surface. But when we begin to face it, listen to it, and explore its meaning, we give it a voice. And in doing so, we also begin to reclaim a part of ourselves that we may have abandoned long ago. Jung's approach to suffering was deeply spiritual, but not religious in the traditional sense. He believed that the human soul, what he called the self, is always seeking wholeness. But that wholeness doesn't come from being perfect or always happy. It comes from embracing all of who we are, including the parts that are hurting. Suffering in this context is a process of awakening. It's the moment when life forces us to slow down, look within, and ask, what am I really feeling? What am I missing? What is this pain trying to teach me? He believed that every individual has a deep inner drive toward growth, a force within the unconscious that wants us to become our fullest selves. But this process, which he called individuation, isn't easy. It often involves confrontation with the shadow, grief from the past, or fear about the future. Suffering becomes the terrain we must walk through to meet our truest self on the other side. One of Jung's most powerful ideas was that meaning, not happiness, is the key to psychological well-being. He said, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. This light doesn't come from escaping pain, but from walking into it with courage and awareness. Many people suffer and feel lost because they believe pain is meaningless. But Jung offered a different view. Pain may not make sense on the surface, but it often points toward a deeper truth that needs to be acknowledged. Think of a person who has spent their whole life being the caretaker for others, always putting themselves last. Eventually, they may experience burnout, resentment, or depression. To Jung, that suffering isn't random. It's the soul's way of demanding balance, self-care, and authenticity. The pain is purposeful. It's asking the person to become more whole, not by abandoning their kindness, but by learning to include their own needs in the picture. Jung also taught that suffering humbles us. It strips away the ego, the false persona we often use to navigate the world. In those quiet, painful moments, we meet ourselves in a more honest and human way. We begin to realize we are not just our achievements or our appearances. We are living souls shaped by joys and wounds alike. Ultimately, Jung's view was hopeful. Pain may be dark, but it's not without light. When we face our suffering with openness and curiosity, we don't just survive, we transform. We become deeper, wiser, and more compassionate, not just toward ourselves, but toward others who suffer too. So when pain visits, instead of asking, "Why me?" Jung would invite us to ask, "What is this trying to awaken in me?" That shift from resistance to reflection can change everything. It turns suffering from a meaningless burden into a meaningful journey, one that may lead us closer to our true essence than anything else ever could. One of Carl Jung's most important and original contributions to psychology is the concept of the shadow. To Jung, the shadow isn't something evil or demonic. It's simply the part of ourselves we don't want to see. It's the side of our personality that we deny, suppress, or hide from others. And often, it's where our most painful experiences live. Trauma, shame, guilt, anger, or unfulfilled desires. But just because we push these things into the unconscious doesn't mean they disappear. In fact, they become even more powerful. Jung believed that the shadow holds the key to our personal growth. He said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." What he meant is that the parts of ourselves we reject don't just sit quietly in the background. They find ways to influence our thoughts, decisions, relationships, and emotional reactions, often without us even realizing it. We might find ourselves lashing out in anger over small things, feeling unexplainable guilt, or repeating self-destructive patterns. These are often signs that the shadow is at work. So how is all this connected to suffering? Jung saw repressed pain as a major part of the shadow. When we experience emotional wounds, especially as children, we often don't know how to process them. We learn to bury them because they're too overwhelming or because we're told to be strong or move on. Over time, these buried emotions form a hidden layer within the psyche, shaping how we see ourselves and the world. The longer they go unacknowledged, the more likely they are to cause confusion, anxiety, and emotional distress. Jung didn't want us to be afraid of the shadow. Instead, he encouraged us to explore it, to shine a light into its darkest corners. He believed that healing begins when we stop running from our pain and start listening to what it's trying to tell us. When we begin to confront our shadow, we often discover that it isn't just made up of negative traits. It can also contain strength, creativity, emotional depth, and lost parts of our potential that we locked away long ago. Let's take an example. Someone who always tries to be nice and avoid conflict might believe they are simply peaceful. But beneath that surface, there may be buried anger, frustration, or a sense of not being heard. This anger, repressed and stored in the shadow, can eventually show up in harmful ways, perhaps through passive-aggressive behavior, depression, or chronic resentment. Jung would say that facing this hidden anger doesn't make someone less kind. It actually makes them more whole. By integrating that part of themselves, they become more authentic and emotionally balanced. Another example is grief. If someone has lost a loved one and never fully allowed themselves to grieve, that unprocessed sorrow can become part of the shadow. It may show up years later as a sense of emptiness, unexplained sadness, or difficulty connecting with others. Jung believed that real healing comes when we allow ourselves to feel what we've buried, to let those old wounds breathe in the light of awareness. Importantly, Jung did not believe that conquering the shadow meant becoming perfect. In fact, he knew that perfection was an illusion. His goal was integration, to bring all parts of ourselves, even the uncomfortable ones, into harmony. The more we understand our shadow, the more we understand ourselves. And the more we understand ourselves, the more we can make conscious choices instead of being ruled by unconscious pain. For older adults, the shadow often becomes especially important. With age comes the wisdom to look back on a lifetime of choices, regrets, and unspoken truths. This can be painful, but it can also be profoundly liberating. Jung saw the second half of life as a sacred time, a time not just for doing, but for being, for facing the shadow, embracing the full story of one's life, and finding peace with the parts we once tried to hide. Facing the shadow isn't easy. It requires courage, honesty, and self-compassion, but the rewards are immense. When we stop pretending to be only our best selves and begin to embrace all that we are, light and dark, we become more human, more grounded, and more free. Our suffering no longer controls us from the shadows. It becomes a path to deeper self-awareness. Jung believed that the shadow is not our enemy. It's a teacher, and though its lessons are difficult, they are some of the most valuable we'll ever learn. When we begin to explore the shadow within, we don't just heal, we grow. We move closer to our truth, and we take one step closer to turning our pain into purpose. Carl Jung believed that the deepest goal of human life wasn't success, fame, or even happiness. It was wholeness, and the journey toward this wholeness he called individuation. It's a long, sometimes painful process, but also one of the most meaningful paths a person can walk. Individuation isn't about becoming someone new. It's about becoming fully yourself, the person you were always meant to be, underneath all the expectations, fears, and false identities we carry. At its core, individuation is about bringing the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche into harmony. That means not just focusing on who we appear to be on the outside, but also integrating all the parts of ourselves we've ignored, denied, or buried deep within. This includes our dreams, fears, instincts, creativity, and, yes, our suffering. Jung believed that suffering is not an obstacle to individuation. It is the gateway. He once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." This doesn't mean we need to seek pain, but rather that when suffering comes, it carries a hidden invitation. Pain forces us to pay attention, to stop living automatically, and to begin asking deeper questions. Who am I, really? What matters most to me? What have I lost? And what have I found through that loss? Most people live with a persona, which is the mask we wear to fit into society. It's not fake, it's just limited. We show the parts of ourselves that are socially acceptable, helpful, or impressive. But behind the mask, there's much more going on. The journey of individuation asks us to go beyond the mask and look at what lies beneath. Our shadow, our wounded inner child, our spiritual hunger, and the quiet voice of the soul. The process of individuation often begins when life doesn't go as planned. For some, it might be a painful loss, like the death of a partner. For others, it could be a health crisis, retirement, or a feeling of emptiness after years of doing what was expected. These painful moments break our routine and make us ask, what now? Jung saw this not as a failure, but as a turning point. When life takes away what we thought defined us, it gives us a chance to discover who we really are. As we explore our inner world, we start to reclaim the lost pieces of our identity. We may discover old passions we left behind. We might see patterns in our behavior that need to change. We may begin to forgive others or ourselves. And slowly, something beautiful begins to happen. We begin to feel more whole. Not perfect, not always peaceful, but real. For Jung, individuation was not a luxury. It was a necessity. He believed that many psychological problems, especially later in life, come from ignoring the inner call toward this kind of integration. When people feel anxiety, depression, or disconnection, it's often because something within them is asking to be acknowledged. And when we respond to that inner voice, when we begin the work of self-reflection, shadow work, and healing, we start to feel alive again in a deeper way. One of the most inspiring aspects of Jung's theory is that individuation is a lifelong process. You're never too old to grow. In fact, Jung believed that the second half of life is especially rich for this kind of inner development. When the distractions of youth fade, we have the opportunity to turn inward and listen to the wisdom that suffering has been trying to teach us all along. Jung compared this journey to alchemy, the ancient process of turning base metals into gold. Our ego, wounds, and confusion are the raw material. Through reflection, self-honesty, and facing our pain, we begin to transform. What was once seen as weakness becomes wisdom. What once caused us shame becomes a source of strength. The gold we create isn't material wealth, it's inner richness. It's the peace that comes from knowing yourself, accepting your story, and living in alignment with your truth. This process is not linear. It doesn't happen all at once. There are setbacks, dark nights of the soul, and moments when we feel lost. But Jung reminds us that the path to wholeness always begins right where we are, especially in our most vulnerable moments. When we stop running from our suffering and instead walk into it with awareness, we begin the sacred work of individuation. In the end, individuation is the art of becoming yourself, not the self others expect, but the self that your soul longs to be. And if you've suffered, if you've broken down and had to rebuild, if you've questioned everything and still kept going, then you are already walking that path. According to Jung, that is the greatest journey any human being can take. Carl Jung introduced many important concepts in psychology, but one of his most meaningful was the idea of archetypes, universal patterns or symbols that live in the collective unconscious of all human beings. These archetypes show up in myths, dreams, art, religion, and personal experiences. They are timeless expressions of the human condition, shaping how we think, feel, and live. And among these, one of the most powerful is the archetype of the wounded healer. The wounded healer is a symbol that appears in stories across cultures and centuries. At its core, it's the figure who has been deeply hurt, yet through that hurt gains the power to heal others. Think of mythological figures like Chiron, the Greek centaur who was wise, gentle, and deeply wounded. Though he could never heal his own wound, he used his pain to become a teacher and healer for others. Jung saw this myth not just as a story, but as a living truth about the human experience. He believed that everyone carries the wounded healer within them. Each of us has suffered in our own way, through loss, betrayal, illness, loneliness, or failure. And often, those wounds feel like barriers. They hurt, they isolate, and they leave us feeling broken. But Jung saw another possibility. He believed that our wounds, when faced with honesty and compassion, could become a source of wisdom, empathy, and transformation, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. In psychological terms, the wounded healer archetype reflects a deep truth, that people who have suffered often become the best listeners, the most compassionate friends, and the most powerful helpers. Their pain has given them insight. They understand what it means to struggle. They don't speak from theory, they speak from lived experience. And in doing so, they can help others feel seen, heard, and understood. But Jung also issued a warning. He emphasized that if we don't face our wounds, we risk passing them on unconsciously. A person who has never dealt with their anger may lash out and hurt others. Someone who hasn't healed from childhood rejection may reject others before they get too close. In this way, unhealed pain spreads pain, but pain that is faced and integrated, that becomes medicine. Jung believed that only the wounded physician heals. In other words, it is our own suffering, once transformed, that gives us the depth and humility to support others on their journey. So how does this idea relate to ordinary life, especially in later years? For many people, getting older can bring reflection on past pain, mistakes made, opportunities missed, relationships lost, and traumas endured. But instead of burying these experiences or letting them create bitterness, Jung would encourage you to look at them through the lens of the wounded healer. What did you learn? What strength did that suffering give you? And how can you now offer that understanding to others through kindness, storytelling, listening, or simply being present? You don't need to be a therapist or a doctor to be a healer. Just by surviving pain and staying open-hearted, you become someone others can turn to. You carry a kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to be loud. You become a source of wisdom not because you have all the answers, but because you've walked through the fire and come out wiser on the other side. Jung's view of healing was never about removing all pain. It was about transforming the meaning of pain. A wound that is acknowledged and honored becomes a source of power. It becomes part of your identity, not as a victim, but as a survivor, not as someone who was broken, but as someone who was shaped. And this isn't only for others, it's for you too. Sometimes being your own healer means revisiting old pain with new eyes. It means allowing yourself to grieve what you never got to grieve. It means forgiving, letting go, or even just sitting with emotions that you once buried. In this gentle process, you begin to reclaim the parts of yourself that were left behind. To Jung, this was sacred work. He believed that the soul seeks not perfection, but authenticity. And when we allow our wounds to speak, not to dominate us, but to guide us, we become more human, more whole, and more able to connect with others on a deep soul-to-soul level. So if you've suffered, and most of us have, remember that you are not alone. Your pain is not wasted. Inside it lives the quiet power of healing, insight, and purpose. And when you embrace your role as the wounded healer, you begin not only to understand your own journey, but to illuminate the path for others who are still walking through their pain. Carl Jung believed that the human psyche has its own language, a language that doesn't speak in words but in images, emotions, and patterns. And this language, he said, becomes especially alive when we suffer. During times of emotional or spiritual crisis, many people report vivid dreams, strange coincidences, or strong inner reactions that seem to come out of nowhere. To Jung, these weren't random. They were messages from the unconscious, the hidden part of our mind that holds the key to healing, transformation, and truth. One of the most direct ways the unconscious communicates is through dreams. Unlike the waking mind, which filters everything through logic and reason, the dream world reveals the deeper story. In dreams, your inner world comes to life. Forgotten feelings, old wounds, unresolved desires, and even glimpses of future possibilities. Jung didn't believe dreams were nonsense or just the brain cleaning itself out. He believed they were a sacred mirror, showing you what your soul is trying to say, especially when you're in pain. For example, if someone dreams they are wandering through a forest, feeling lost, it might reflect their real-life experience of confusion or isolation. If they dream of a broken object, it could symbolize something within them that feels damaged. Jung taught that interpreting these images isn't about quick answers. It's about entering into a relationship with your inner world. He encouraged people to reflect on their dreams, keep a journal, and gently ask, "What part of me is this image trying to show me?" Jung also explored the world of symbols, which he believed were the natural language of the unconscious. Symbols appear in dreams, myths, art, religion, and even in everyday life. A cross, a river, a mountain, a circle. These are not just decorations or abstract concepts. They carry emotional weight. They stir something inside us. Jung said that symbols are transformers of psychic energy. They help turn raw pain or confusion into insight and direction. This is especially true in moments of suffering. When people go through grief, illness, or personal loss, they often feel disconnected from themselves. They may not have words for what they're experiencing, but a dream, a symbol, or even a strong image from nature, a storm, a wounded bird, a flickering candle, can give form to the formless. It can help us feel what logic can't explain. And in that feeling, healing begins. Jung believed that when you are in pain, your unconscious will try to help you, but you have to be willing to listen. This might mean paying attention to dreams, but also to synchronicities, those meaningful coincidences that seem too perfect to be random. You think about someone you haven't seen in years, and they call. You're wrestling with a decision, and a book falls off the shelf with just the message you needed. These events, Jung said, are not accidents. They are signs that your inner and outer worlds are speaking to each other. This idea may sound mystical, but Jung treated it with deep respect. He wasn't saying that every coincidence has a message, but that in times of suffering, the unconscious becomes more active. It wants to guide you, to support you, to help you grow. And often it does so in quiet, subtle, symbolic ways. For those in later life, this symbolic language can be even more important. As the outer roles of work, parenting, and responsibility begin to fade, the inner world becomes more central. Dreams become more vivid. Questions about meaning, purpose, and legacy begin to rise. Jung encouraged older adults to see this not as a decline, but as a sacred transition. He believed that the second half of life is when the soul speaks the loudest, if we have the courage to listen. You don't need to be a psychologist to understand this. It begins with a willingness to slow down, reflect, and stay open. When you dream, write it down. When a symbol keeps showing up in your life, a bird, a song, a phrase, pause and ask, what might this mean for me right now? These small practices build a bridge between the conscious and unconscious mind, allowing healing to move more freely. Jung didn't promise that symbols would solve all our problems or that dreams would erase our pain. But he did believe that when we engage with this inner language, we begin to shift. Our suffering no longer feels random or empty. It becomes part of a larger, meaningful story, the story of a soul seeking to become whole. In the end, Jung taught us that pain doesn't just cry out, it speaks, and its voice is often found in symbols, dreams, and mysterious connections. If we dare to listen, we discover that even in our darkest moments, the soul is still speaking, still reaching out, still guiding us toward understanding, purpose, and peace. Carl Jung never denied that suffering is painful. He knew that life brings loss, grief, fear, and struggle. But what made his perspective so unique and so powerful was the belief that suffering could be transformed. Not avoided, not erased, but turned into something deeply meaningful. In Jung's view, the purpose of suffering wasn't to break us, it was to awaken us, to call us inward, to reconnect us with the parts of ourselves we've forgotten, abandoned, or never truly known. In modern life, suffering is often seen as a problem to be fixed as quickly as possible. We're surrounded by messages telling us to stay positive, move on, or look on the bright side. While these can offer temporary comfort, Jung would say that they miss the point. Real healing doesn't come from escaping pain. It comes from understanding it, listening to it, allowing it to become part of our story. Jung's legacy teaches us that suffering can be purposeful if we choose to engage with it consciously. That means asking the hard questions. What is this pain trying to show me? What old wound is being stirred? What part of me have I neglected or silenced? These questions aren't always easy to answer, but they are the beginning of transformation. And transformation, according to Jung, is not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more fully yourself. He believed that within every person is a self, a central guiding force that knows who you are and who you're meant to become. Suffering often disconnects us from this self, but when we begin to reflect on our pain, when we look inward instead of outward, we start to reestablish that connection. One of Jung's most comforting ideas was that it's never too late to begin this work. No matter how many years have passed, no matter what you've been through, there is always a path back to the self. In fact, Jung believed that the second half of life is when the greatest healing and growth can occur. Why? Because we finally have the time, the experience, and the wisdom to stop running from our inner world and start listening to it. So how do we turn suffering into purpose? It begins with small acts of courage, journaling through grief, speaking honestly with a friend, revisiting old memories not to relive them, but to understand them, seeking help when we need it, not because we are weak, but because we are ready to grow. These are the first steps of the journey Jung called individuation, and they matter more than we often realize. Another path to purpose lies in sharing our story. Jung believed that when we give voice to our suffering, we not only heal ourselves, we help others feel less alone. That's the power of the wounded healer archetype. Your pain, once processed, becomes wisdom. Your scars become symbols of strength. Whether you speak to a friend, write your reflections, volunteer your time, or simply live with more presence and compassion, your experience becomes a source of light for someone else walking through darkness. Jung also taught us to pay attention to our dreams, our symbols, and our inner imagery. These are not just personal quirks, they are guidance. They are how the unconscious leads us toward balance, insight, and direction. Suffering often activates this inner voice more clearly. In pain, the soul begins to speak, and if we learn to listen, we receive answers we didn't even know we were seeking. More than anything, Jung offered hope. He didn't promise a life without pain, but he gave us a way to make sense of pain. He taught that what feels like an ending may actually be the beginning of a deeper journey, that within the darkness there is often a light waiting to be found, not outside of us, but within. So if you're suffering right now, know this: it's not the end of your story. According to Jung, it may be the very chapter where your true self begins to emerge, the place where you stop trying to be who others expect you to be and start becoming who you were always meant to be. Suffering invites us to wake up, to slow down, to reflect, and finally to rise, wiser, softer, more authentic. This is Jung's great message for modern life, that in a world full of noise and distraction, we each carry an inner compass. And even when we're hurting, even when we're lost, that compass is always pointing us home, to meaning, to healing, and to purpose.